What does the Six Nations Championship mean to you?
Power.
Who can stop this big man?
Pace.
Excellent run, and it's a try.
Pain.
That was a thumping battle.
Pride.
You do that, D1.
Passion. Panache.
Mind-blowing.
Six Nations Rugby starts with Italy versus Scotland, live on radio and television tomorrow with BBC Sports Scotland.
And Friday Sports Scene previews Scotland's opening Six Nations clash with Italy, along with the weekend's other sporting fixtures on BBC One Scotland at 10:55. Now on BBC Two Scotland, Newsnight with Jeremy Vine.
Is diplomatic sanctions against Austria. But will cancelling a few dinners force Jörg Haider's party from power? Good evening. The United States will limit contacts with the Austrian government, it says. Today, MPs in that new coalition administration crept into the presidential palace to be sworn in, obviously embarrassed, as thousands of their fellow countrymen rioted. These are the latest pictures from Vienna. Already, the opposition is threatening to bring down the new government. So I'll be asking one of its leaders, won't that only make heroes of the far right? And in the week, Britain's biggest ever serial killer turned out to be a family doctor. In whom can we trust? Is suspicion safer? Plus, from Boston, one of the great thinkers of our time, Noam Chomsky, gives Newsnight some pithy thoughts on what is wrong with the race for the American presidency.
You're going to need millions and millions of dollars even to appear. And where's that money come from?
So it has happened. The far-right Freedom Party, which has voiced approval in the past for some Nazi policies, is in power now in Austria, in a coalition government with conservatives. There have been diplomatic protests from countries all around the world, but none of that stopped the Austrian president, Thomas Klestil, swearing in the country's new cabinet today. Outside the Hofburg Palace, thousands of demonstrators clashed with police as the president urged them not to prejudge the new government. Its far-right members have now signed a document essentially repudiating Nazi Germany, but that did not curb the anger. David Sells has been watching the day's events.
Austrians who loathe Jörg Haider and his Freedom Party were again on the warpath tonight in Vienna. There are plenty of them. 3 voters in every 4, after all, did not support Haider in the October election. But demonstrations of this order have been a rarity in Austria. It's not only abroad that the Haider effect has been unsettling. This morning, Austria's President Klestil bowed to the inevitable and swore in the new coalition government. He was stony-faced. His efforts to muster a government of national unity had clearly failed, and new elections, with the world shouting abuse, would only benefit Mr. Haider himself. Austria's Western allies are at 6s and 7s. The Americans, for their part, have recalled their ambassador for consultations. In diplomatic terms, a modest move.
She will be coming back to Washington to report to me for further consultations, and so that upon her return to Austria, she can continue to convey our concerns about what their policies might be.
On Monday, Austria's 14 EU partners promised a sort of diplomatic quarantine if democracy took its course and Haider's Freedom Party entered the Austrian government. So, now, for the time being, EU countries will not support Austrian candidates for international jobs. Bilateral ministerial contacts will be stopped. EU states will no longer receive Austria's ambassadors at a ministerial level. Austria, for its part, will feel miffed, but it will hardly be quaking in its boots. Sanctions, so far, are wondrously marginal. In Belgium, schools have cancelled Austrian ski trips. An order for 6 Austrian ambulances has been suspended, and Belgium is now refusing to lend a Gauguin painting to an Austrian museum. In Copenhagen, Danish diplomats have tightened their waistcoats and pulled out of an embassy dinner. The strongest reaction has come from Israel, which today recalled its ambassador on an indefinite basis. The world is getting itself into a real pickle over Austria, indulging itself in moral outrage without, it seems, actually knowing what it's up to. Yes, Jörg Haider is a slippery populist, a master of the protest vote with a notoriously loose lip. But he and his party thrive on this sort of bullying. Yes, Austrians have been a mite slow in coming to terms with their Nazi past. But what is the world seeking to achieve with its sanctions and dinner bans? And what, for instance, is to be the EU's exit strategy? What will be the criteria for declaring Austria a disease-free zone? How come, too, that Austria is being judged on words, not deeds, the words of a man who's not even in the government? With police and demonstrators still at odds, President Klestil tonight spoke to the Austrian people on television. The People's and Freedom parties had a parliamentary majority, he said. That had to be respected, but so too did other commitments.
I've told the party leaders yesterday that not accepting these commitments would have very heavy, serious consequences as much domestic as abroad. Dear Austrians, Austria is a stable democracy, a well-functioning state based on the rule of law, which has, over decades, acquired recognition in Europe and internationally. This prestige we have to now conserve and further.
Jörg Haider struck his deal with the leader of the Conservative People's Party, Wolfgang Schüssel, who had abandoned negotiations with the ruling Social Democrats. But why, after 13 years of partnership with the Social Democrats, suddenly give up?
For the Socialist Party, they have thrown away an agreement which we had already, to form a new coalition, and therefore there is unfortunately no alternative here in Austria except new elections. And new elections would neither help Austria, and frankly, new elections wouldn't help my party either.
Well, yes, but some critics suspect that Dr. Schüssel is using Haider to become top dog himself in Austria's parliament after long years as number 2, as vice-chancellor and foreign minister in the outgoing Social Democrat-led coalition. Dr. Schüssel, of course, disagrees, and he says he's locked the Haider party into democratic ways. But he said it wouldn't be easy.
The situation may be difficult, but my motto is when things are difficult, don't give up. Don't start again and waste years doing it. We Austrians mustn't pretend that it's easy, but for heaven's sake, we have to steady our nerves and keep cool. And also be quite firm about the idea that we have to show our friends abroad that we have nothing to be ashamed of. We're not a pariah state. We can't be compared with Serbia. We're not a third world state when it comes to democracy.
Wir sind kein Entwicklungsland in Sachen Demokratie.
The demonstrators doubtless feel that the EU and others are on their side, and Austrian society is certainly divided when it comes to the Freedom Party. That said, the EU's response to Haider has been, in the words of one British academic who's an Austria specialist, premature and hasty, likely in the short term to benefit Haider politically rather than weaken him.
David Sells there. A few moments ago I spoke to Dr. Alfred Gusenbauer, one of the leaders of Austria's opposition Social Democratic Party, and I began by asking for his response to the decision of the American government to recall its ambassador.
Well, I think that the Americans are concerned, and I have a full understanding for the American concern. The Austrian population, of course, thinks that reactions by the international community are a little bit exaggerated, because also Mr. Haider will not be able definitely to destabilize the Austrian democracy.
But what's your view as the opposition? Do you think the Americans have acted in a way that's over the top or not done enough?
Well, I think it's not our task to talk to the Americans and say, listen, you should be tougher or not. Our task is to picture quite clearly what is the Austrian reality, and as we as Social Democrats are among those who are the only voice accepted by the international community. I think we want to deliver a realistic picture of the country, and this is that despite the fact that the Haider party is in government, 3/4 of the Austrian population did not vote for him.
There was an interesting quote from one American official who was referring to the fact that Mr. Haider's support is currently going up in Austria, and he said we have to deal with this subtly because every time the Freedom Party is attacked from abroad, he said, their numbers go up.
Well, this might be a temporary reaction that is caused by the fact that Austrians think that Austria has to decide who should be in the future government. But I think that in the long run, when people really get a feeling of the effects of the international isolation, when they have the clear experiences of the new governmental program, and when they really have to, I would say, suffer from the consequences of this situation, there rather soon will be a turnaround in public opinion.
So are you going to try and bring this government down?
Of course, it's, I think, the task of an opposition to bring a government down, and if a government is of such a burden for the population and for the country, one has to start from the very, very beginning to attack this government quite fiercely, and therefore we will issue the strongest measures and instruments already in the first session of the Parliament.
On the question of exactly what it is that Mr. Haider has done and said, he has in the past expressed support for some Nazi policies, but he has since apologized, and I understand the last 24 hours he's signed a statement condemning xenophobia and racism and anti-Semitism. So from your point of view, might he not be in the clear?
Well, I would say you cannot believe or trust Mr. Haider because he will continue making statements than the ones incriminated. And his strategy always is to attack, to make statements that are politically absolutely unacceptable. And after a certain protest, when he thinks it's not useful anymore to stand with the statement, he says, well, if people feel affected badly by this statement, I'm prepared to apologize. This we know already for many, many years, and the conclusion you can draw is you cannot rely or trust in Mr. Haider.
Now, what we've seen in Vienna tonight, these demonstrations and riots, seem to suggest that people don't trust you either to make their case for them. They don't want it done through democracy anymore. They're going to do it through violence because that's the only way they feel that they can get their way.
You have, of course, a small minority that is using violence, and I think this is absolutely non-acceptable. But you will see in several days that there will be a huge peaceful manifestation, nationwide manifestation here in Vienna that will clearly indicate that the majority of the Austrian population is not going to support that government.
Thank you very much indeed. The list of professions which traditionally do not inspire public trust is known to us all, and rather embarrassing if, like journalists, you happen to work in one of them. The media, politics, anything to do with estate agents or second-hand cars, we are used to the idea of not trusting where they're concerned. But other professions are now risking finding themselves in that dangerous category. Who completely trusts their family doctor after the Shipman case? How can the police ask for trust in the wake of the Lawrence inquiry? What is the nanny doing to the children while the parents are at work? We'll be discussing this in a moment, but how trust can die.
My mother trusted Dr. Shipman. He cynically and callously betrayed that trust.
She was a healthy, active woman with a full life to lead.
Sadly, nothing that's happened here, nor can happen in the future, can bring about my mum and all the other victims.
Steady, bespectacled, middle-aged, the image of a trusted family doctor. Harold Shipman's terrible crimes were extreme acts of betrayal. But before they were detected, he was shielded for years by the simple faith the local community had in him, the feeling that a doctor can and should be trusted.
The GP is the gateway into the whole of the National Health Service, onto consultants, onto medical practices, etc. And that trust in the first place has got to be there for a patient to go and see the doctor, to know that the advice that they're given by that doctor is the best advice that can be given. And that can only be given if both parties trust each other.
The Hippocratic Oath remains central to modern codes of medical ethics. Doctors promise,
"With holiness and purity I will pass my life and practice my art. Into whatever houses I enter, I will go into them for the benefit of the sick, and will abstain from every voluntary act of mischief and corruption."
It was a promise that seemed to be in tatters when an inquiry showed that 3 Bristol heart surgeons had continued operating on babies despite appalling results. And then the widespread practice of keeping children's organs for medical research was shockingly revealed as well. The medical profession were accused of grave robbing and worse.
You're dealing with your very life, your own existence, as it were. I think that now that trust is being questioned, not to be taken away completely, but not just taken as read.
Doctors are not the only professionals in our midst who are being called to account. The breach of trust that was exposed by the Lawrence inquiry suggested police work was being sabotaged by racism. Suddenly it wasn't just black people saying that, it was everybody. And nowadays the people purporting to care for children often say they're viewed with suspicion, as if they can't be doing it out of the purest motives. In other turbulent times, we might have turned to spiritual and religious leaders, but they have felt their moral authority slip away from them.
What that seems to mean, I think, is a falling back on very individualistic sorts of religions where people feel they can't trust the clergy don't have the authority to mediate for them. They can have their own opinions, but that the God that they trust has become entirely internal to them. They choose the bits that they do and don't trust.
A survey last year compared our trust for different figures of authority. Doctors topped the table then, with 74% of the public trusting them a lot. The police were trusted a lot by 53% of the public. But people were much more sceptical of scientists, with only 35% thinking they were entirely trustworthy.
Incorrect.
It wasn't always so. A famous American experiment in the 1960s showed volunteers were willing to apply what they were told were lethal electric shocks to other people, simply because someone in a white coat said they should do it. These days, scientists attract more suspicion, both for the consequences of their discoveries and for their motives at a time when research has become more lucrative.
More and more one feels that when scientists speak in public about whatever they happen to be speaking about, they are to some extent towing some industrial party line, because they have to, because their whole income depends on that. So now we've got 2 layers of suspicion, and I think that's a very unhealthy state of affairs.
The government has placed huge faith in setting up inquiries and targets to scrutinise how professions perform when they serve the public. Action is promised in the wake of the Shipman verdict. But once trust has gone, it is very difficult to get it back.
In what conditions does trust pay off? And the answer is when trust is rewarded with respect from other people. If you take away personal responsibility, if you replace it with some overarching institution, then you've taken away the individual's responsibility and you've taken away the need for them to be trusted. And I think then they become untrustworthy.
You can't trust statisticians, you can't trust scientists, you can't trust politicians, many of whom I would have to say have not been very worthy of our trust. But if you can't trust anybody, then the only thing you can trust is your own gut instinct. And we do actually know that our own gut instincts are frequently rather inaccurate.
And yet it is hard work to question everything we normally take for granted. If we have in the past been too trusting, is there now a danger of becoming too suspicious? We're joined now by Angela McRobbie, a sociologist, by Christina Adone of the New Statesman, by Dr. Steve Gillam of the King's Fund, and Maria Shortis, who lost her child in the Bristol heart scandal. Dr. Steve Gillam, first of all, just to check the premise that we're working on, do you think we now trust less than we used to?
I think we do. I think as doctors we recognise our declining authority, if you like, and that this has obviously been accelerated by recent events, but something that's been going on over years and manifest in various ways. We face more criticism of our work, more complaints, more litigation, declining levels of satisfaction with our work. But I think it's important to distinguish between the trust in professionals as sources of expertise and knowledge, and the very much more personal trust that is a product of a personal relationship, and as your previous clip was saying, derives from a relationship fostered over time.
Maria, you obviously had a very personal experience of the kind of reason people stop trusting doctors. Do you agree with that?
I think that you have to look at this in context. Where you have parents with severely ill children, or with children who are facing routine surgery for any speciality, you're not in a situation where you have built up a relationship of trust with the doctor. You go in and your child's life is at risk. You have to trust the experts who are giving you information about the risks of failure of operations or the successful outcomes of operations. Therefore, you're not in a position where you can make decisions for your child. You are totally dependent on those doctors giving you realistic information, genuine information. And if they're misleading you, the effect of that on you afterwards, when you find that out, is to plunge you straight back in to a grieving process that you thought you had gone through.
Angela McRobbie, if Harold Shipman's patients were wrong to trust him, doesn't it follow that everyone is wrong to trust their doctor?
Well, I think that one of the issue is that perhaps too often trust is confused with deference and with hierarchy and with an enormous disparity of relations of power and powerlessness. And I think the patients who were most likely to trust Dr. Shipman were those who actually didn't feel in control of the situation, who weren't confident enough to actually assert themselves, and who had that very kind of traditional deference towards the doctor as somebody who was virtually infallible.
Older patients?
Indeed, yes.
Can I come in there? I'd have to say that the people who are really disenfranchised and who do have to trust are the elderly, the vulnerable, people who are impoverished, and babies, you know, parents of babies they have to trust. That those of us who are independent, have independent means, who are healthy, can ask questions,
Christina
can
Donny,
challenge.
do you think, is trust going as a result of a generational movement here, that young people simply don't want to trust authority figures?
Well, I think that certainly we can concentrate on the Shipman case and therefore on the National Health Service and indeed on doctors all across the board. But I think that the whole landscape of our sacred institutions has changed, has fragmented. And I think that unfortunately we're talking about, as the clip showed, police, the police force. I mean, stop and search. Has that increased the trust of a community in its bobbies? I doubt it. Indeed, quite the opposite. Doctors, there are not only Shipmans out there. We're talking about the man in the white coat whom you've been brought up to trust, who asks you to sit there on a trolley or lie there on a trolley in a ward for hours on end while nobody goes to you. So there are I would say, infinite points of contact during a citizen's every day when he comes in contact with a hitherto sacred institution and suddenly finds feet of clay, and from there distrust grows.
But that's always happened, hasn't it?
I think much more so now than ever before, and possibly much more so because it is a media, if not ventilated affair. It is certainly a media the media serves as a loudspeaker for that kind of incident. And you know, whether it's Lord Winston condemning the NHS or it's the media baying like dogs outside Dr. Shipman's home, we are brought to bear with these facts. And I think that it is a tremendous knock on this confidence that we have placed in everything from the police to the health system.
Well, might it not be a good thing in some ways? Because if you don't trust, you don't risk, do you? Where you go and see your doctor and you immediately start asking 100 questions. You're much less likely to suffer to be murdered, for example.
Well, of course, I think that blind trust, unquestioning trust may not be a good thing. It's a good thing, clearly, that people are more critical and more questioning. Interestingly, I think, well, there's plenty of evidence that older people are more satisfied, more trusting, if you like, in the service, in what they're getting, that younger people may have different demands, maybe more critical, and that's appropriate. These things are changing, and of course I think one has to remember that we want different things at different times in our lives. It may be that older people place more, attach a higher priority to a personal relationship with somebody they know over time, looking after a chronic condition, than younger people might. I think the other thing to say is that doctors, it is true, have not always been very good at sharing information.
But more broadly, is it a good thing, Angela, if trust is going?
Oh, I think it's absolutely a good thing that we live in a society sort of where the end of trust is actually quite normative. I think for far too long, trust was only functional in a traditional society where people were able to spend a lot of time with each other, and trust was something that was built up over years. That really is absolutely not appropriate now. I mean, with the whole kind of time-space change means that you know, even
there's a tremendous effort not to trust, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it's a lot of time as well. I mean, in a traditional society, people would say, well, they left their children with their next door neighbours, but actually they would only leave their children with their next door neighbours if they knew their next door neighbours for 10 years or 15 years. They wouldn't leave them if they just moved in.
If we continue your argument with its logical progression, we're going to be in a society where everybody is suspicious of one another, whether it's of institutions or individuals. And I think that one of the most horrifying prospects is the one that we saw when we were looking at the Haider film. And you see people taking to the streets because they no longer trust their government to deliver democracy in its best concept, and start deploying the kind of direct action that made Seattle such a startling factor, that made Davos a mini Seattle, and that could come back here and lead to anarchy. Is that what you think?
No, because I think the end of trust actually often marks a process of political empowerment. For example, in the late 60s, early 70s, women generally felt very discontent with medical advice that they were getting. They didn't really have any way of expressing that, and it was only really by forming a kind of self-help pressure group, collective, almost kind of knowledge that was informal, but nonetheless gathering that together, producing books like Our Bodies, Ourselves, and that then fed into women clinics, and it actually had an empowering role.
Let me put this to Maria, because I know you run something called the Constructive Dialogue for Clinical Accountability, which is essentially a long way of saying that it's a way of establishing some kind of formal trust relationship with doctors.
Yes, it is. I think we've got to start building up public confidence in the medical profession. We have one medical profession.
But more generally, what do you think of these points?
Well, it's more generally. I have to go back to what I know. My experience is that the tragedies that we have seen, I've been part of, have been avoidable. And they happened because there were no safeguards, because there was no clinical accountability, because there is no clinical accountability.
But isn't trust a good thing in life? You start your car, you trust it won't explode. You don't want to have to worry that it's...
You have to have some level of trust, but that's different to deference, which you were talking about, and it's different to dependency. We need a society that already our society is far more educated than it was 40 years ago. We have access to information, we can inform ourselves. If you look at the medical students coming through today, they are not just middle-class white men. There's an ethnic mix, there are more women coming in, society's changing. There will be a cultural change, and there's a lot of positive hope, I feel, for the future. But right now, the institutions which do not want accountability or are afraid to talk about it or afraid to engage with a debate on, say, independent inspection of the medical profession are the Royal Colleges, are the GMC. To whom are they accountable? To whom are they responsible?
Dr. Gillam?
I would agree with much of this that's been said. I'm sure we do need to work hard to restore faith in the medical profession. I think I disagree with Angela that clearly there are situations, life situations, in which you need to be able to repose absolute trust in your health professionals, where you need to be absolutely confident that they're making decisions on your behalf. People realise that, and clearly there is much that could be done, strengthening regulatory mechanisms
I can only do that
improve.
If I checked out that what you were telling me was that I'd have to have a two-way process of communication.
Indeed, and doctors, I think,
you'd have to be informed and you'd have to empower yourself through information.
I think there's clearly much that can be done to improve doctors' skills in sharing decision-making, in imparting that confidence to their patients that they're doing that, in delivering information in ways that they understand.
But Angela Robbie, it comes down to this point, doesn't it, that in a way, the mystique that surrounds professionals is useful to them and to us, isn't it? When you leave the doctor's surgery and he said to you, you're going to be okay, you want to go out believing it.
Well, of course that's right, and I think that one of the really important things that's happened in the last 10 years is that most professionals have been forced to become more accountable, and they've been forced to open their doors, open the classrooms and the seminars and the lecture theatres. They've been inspected, they've had Ofsteds, you know, there's been a general process.
But that destroys the mystique, doesn't it?
All to the good.
All to the good.
What role
well, Christina, don't you think we need some mystique from professionals so that we actually don't have to keep... You don't want to go in with a balance sheet, do you, when you go and see...
I don't think we need mystique, but I do think that what we need is to have professions that are accountable, that are not frightened of transparency, that are not frightened of sharing information, and that also are held, you know, are shown trust by the powers that be. You know, for instance, if the government had shown more trust in its NHS, perhaps we wouldn't have been in the situation of Bristol, and perhaps we wouldn't have been in the situation, certainly of the NHS as it is right now, where it is underfunded and overstaffed.
I understand that argument.
Underfunded and